Hey everyone, and welcome to another meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Kanakis. My co-host this evening, Mr. Phil Bossman. Hello, Phil. How are you?
Good evening. I'm doing well. I'm
Yeah.
super excited.
Yes. Hey, Phil. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about what? What's our topic tonight?
We're going to be talking about APIs, application programming interfaces, and we have Stevie Coaster, also known as Steven Valdinger, is he's going to give us a quick little intro on working with APIs, and he's going to share some knowledge. How you doing, Stevie?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Glad to be
Stevie.
back.
Yeah, Stevie, thank you for joining us tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to give you a little intro here, Stevie is going to be doing an intro on APIs tonight, and in about 45 to 60 days, we're going to have him back, and he's going to do a deeper dive on APIs. So this is like a part 1 and part 2, and so if you're watching this at home, make sure you check out the part 2 version of this. If you are watching it at home, you can always join us in person. You can check out our group and find us at rtpsug.com. We'll go to Meetup, and then you can join us and be part of the live demos. But with that, we'd like to hand it over to Mr. Stevie Valdinger tonight and let him take it away.
Alrighty, guys. Well, again, thanks for having me back. It's always a good time to present to this group. Very thankful that you're going to let me set up some disappointment for the next 60 minutes or so. As they said, kind of coming into this last minute, so I kind of cobbled this together. So I'm flying by the seat of my pants a little bit. But yeah, who am I? As I've said, I'm Steve Valdinger, aka Stevie Coaster, across all the socials, Twitter, Discord, GitHub, etc., etc. You can find me there. Support manager at Chocolate Software is what I do in my day job. So I do a lot of package management, PowerShell, some API stuff, a lot of automation related activities go on in my day to day. So it's always a good time. Always excited to wake up and go to work, and really looking forward to diving into this with you guys. So without further ado, I hate slides, so we're done with them. As mentioned, APIs, what are they? They are application programming interfaces. What does that actually mean? It's a way for one system to talk to another. Say you've got one system that's written in C# that has the need to receive data from another system that might be in Python. Well, those two systems are written in two different languages, right? C#, Python, and then there's this thing that sits up here that they both need to talk to. What is that universal language that both C# and Python can speak? That's an API. That's an application programming interface. That means that C# can perform requests against that API the same way that Python can, even though the language that you write the requests and the code in is different. It looks very, very different when you go between the two. The data that you get back is the same. Now, it might be different types coming back in terms of what C#'s data structure will look like coming back to you, as opposed to Python, or in this case, we're going to be talking about PowerShell and getting PowerShell objects back. But at the end of the day, when you send a request in whatever language to the API is programmed in such a way that it has a very structured data tree behind it that allows that stuff to come back. You'll always get the same properties, etc., coming back from that API. PowerShell really makes working with APIs easy. We'll dive into that a little bit later. The first thing I want to do is kind of talk about how to approach working with an API, because there's a bunch of different interfaces out there. There's a bunch of different ways to document these things. And if you've known me for any length of time, you'll know that I will preach to the choir and to my grave that documentation is user experience. And if your documentation sucks, people aren't going to use your stuff. So thankfully, there's a whole lot of really good tooling out there today to make writing your documentation for your APIs very, very nice and approachable. The first example of that we're going to look at is called Swagger.
Steve.
And yeah.
So before you get too far there, I had a question about what you were just talking about, just a clarification. So the data that's coming back from an API is sort of a standard raw data format.
Correct.
And then
Just
whatever
keep
you're
in mind.
reading that with, in this case, PowerShell, is going to transform that into the tool that you're using to read that API, right? So if it's
Exactly.
Python, it's Python data. If it's PowerShell, it's PowerShell that comes back. But the data that comes back from the API is sort of, it's basic. It's not
Yep.
configured to the program, right? The program does the
Correct.
conversion when it gets the data.
Correct. Exactly. Typically, in 90% of use cases, that data is going to come back to you as JSON, and then it's up to the programming language to interpret that as something. And it might come back to you as plain text. It might come back to you as XML. It just depends on the API, however its schema is defined in terms of how the data is going to come back to you. 95 or higher % amount of the time, that's going to be JSON, but it could be something else. And hopefully the API is documented in such a way that it tells you what to expect from that endpoint.
Okay. And so the benefit there is when stuff comes back and you're using PowerShell, PowerShell does quite a bit of work behind the scenes to make that into an object that we're used to with PowerShell. When you're using another language, it may not be that convenient. You may have to do some work.
Correct. Yeah. In C#, for example, you'll probably have to receive that JSON and then serialize it into some sort of way. Maybe you've got a class that has certain properties on it, and you take that serialized JSON to populate the different properties on that class. Say if you had an API endpoint, for example, called car, and that API, when you did a GET request, sent you back the make, the model, the color, number of doors it had, how big the motor was, et cetera, et cetera. You could have a class in C# that says, hey, this is class my car, and it has these properties. It's make, model, color, door number, whatever. You would receive that JSON in and then set those properties based on the response of the JSON and then do something with it. PowerShell is super awesome in that if you do an Invoke-RestMethod against an API, it automatically takes that JSON and turns it in to a PowerShell object for you. So you get all those properties back, et cetera, et cetera.
And one request.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I was just going to say, one of the big advantages of working with APIs is different languages have different strengths and different focuses. So in C#, where you're saying, I want something that's very strongly typed and memory safe, you may be best served by keeping it in C# because you know exactly what everything's going to look like, basically 100% of the time, unless you're really throwing out a different pattern. But in PowerShell, you're saying, hey, I just need flexibility. Take the data that comes in and parse it to something that I can be over and using. And that's really nice that, a web server may have a very different focus to here's how the data is going to be used versus a PowerShell client trying to just say, hey, get me the data and let me have some properties to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing stopping you inside of PowerShell too of doing some work to capture that response from Invoke-RestMethod and then taking that data, creating your own PS custom object that's got strongly typed data inside of it, and just returning that. Maybe you let the web server send you everything, and then you send back to the user a PS custom object that's only got 3 or 4 things on it, whereas the web server sent you 12, etc. So it is very, very flexible inside of PowerShell as well. But yes, you are correct. C# is very, very type safe, and you kind of need to use the language that makes the most sense to you. This is a PowerShell group. We're going to do it all in PowerShell. But if you've got other developers on your team or other areas of your business that use other programming languages, they can still leverage this stuff because an API is universal. But not to digress too much. Let's dive into the Swagger doc.
We have 2 quick requests.
Make this a little bigger because I was using this before I started.
I was going to say if you could bump that up just a little bit, and then some of the guys were asking when it fits appropriately, if you can just maybe talk about Invoke-RestMethod versus Invoke-WebRequest. But that could be anytime.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll dive into that stuff a little bit little bit later because I'd like to show the difference rather than while I'm talking through it. So this is a Swagger doc. So if you look, we've got this link here that says swagger.json. You can see this in its raw JSON format, but Swagger is, so this is the schema for this particular API. And this is a Sonatype Nexus repository server. This is the schema for that API. When you do a certain request, say to this endpoint, you make a GET request, it's going to give you back this kind of a response, and then these things here. It's really hard to read it in this format, and so they thought, let's make this prettier. This is what Swagger gives you. And then the really cool thing about Swagger, the thing I like about it a lot, is I could come in here and let's pick this V1 blob stores endpoint. I can look at it and see that, oh, this doesn't take any parameters. It's going to give me a 200 response back if the request was okay. And this is the type of data that it's going to send me back, so that I know from a programming perspective, when I go to wire this up and write a PowerShell commandlet or whatever to interact with this, this is the data that I'm going to get back. And if I want to look at this in a little bit more detail, I can click on model and expand this out, and it gets a little hairy trying to expand this out a little bit, but you can then more clearly see that name is a string, type is a string, unavailable is a Boolean, we have some integers in here, et cetera, et cetera. So Swagger really cleanly defines, well, the JSON clearly defines the schema for the API, but Swagger gives you a really nice UI on top of it to expose it. And the nice thing with Swagger is you get these little try it out buttons. So if I were to try this out, for example, you'll get this execute button. And when I execute this, it's going to give me an example, which is a curl request. It always seems to be curl. It's very, very rare that you get a PowerShell centric example here, but it gives me the curl command that I would need to do the same exact thing. It gives me the exact request URL that I sent it to, and then it gives me the actual response from the API. So in this case, I only have one blob store on the server, and these are the properties of that blob store returned from the JSON. So when you're thinking about interacting with an API, PowerShell is a really, really, really good candidate for wrapping this API, because all the data you really need to make a really good commandlet for this is in here. So if we were to break this down for just a second, we've got a method, which there can be many methods for interacting with an API. A GET request, you send a request to an API, and it sends you data back. It says, hey, give me the information from this endpoint, perhaps with these parameters, sometimes with no parameters at all, and it sends you back a response with that data as defined in the schema. A post request is where you say, hey, here's an endpoint where I can create something, or I can add something to this system via this API, via this interface. So it allows you to craft a body, which is in PowerShell will be nothing more than a hash table with these properties. So if I wanted to, for example, create a new file blob store, I could say, hey, I want to do a post request to this endpoint with a content type of application.json or application/JSON. And my body needs to have these properties inside of it. And if I get everything right and I send that request, I will get a new file blob store created, for example. And there's other methods in here too. We've got some puts, which is, hey, here's some data. I want to update a record. It's going to update that record. Now, and a put will say, here's all of the stuff for this schema. if I don't fill all of this stuff out, the put will allow nulls into some of those fields, which may not be what you want. There's no patch types in this particular API, but there's a very important difference between a put and a patch. A patch will update only the stuff in the body that you gave it. So say you've got a schema that's name, ID, and telephone number, for example, and you do a put request with name of Bob and an ID of 3 and a telephone number of some 7-digit telephone number. The put request will update all of those things. Now you do the same put request again to update Bob by changing his name from Bob to Bill. And then that's all you put in there. You say, hey, send this Bill request in there. It's not going to work. You're going to get a new record with Bill with nulls for everything else, or an error depending on the API spec. But rather, if you did a patch and you sent a request, it would only update the field that you had in the body. Very, very important difference. And you have to watch out for the APIs too, because puts and patches can be implemented to where a put does a patch or a patch does a put, or they're just wrong. Hopefully the people that wrote the API kind of know what they're doing and have done the right thing in terms of this is a put request, so you expect a certain thing to happen, and a patch request, you expect a certain thing to happen, and they've got it right. But if 9 times out of 10, not very many people deal with patches, you'll see puts an awful lot more. And then, of course, you have your deletes, which does exactly what it says on the tin. If you send a request to this endpoint, it will delete whatever is in the body. A good one to give you an example of that. Do we have a blob store one? Yeah. So if you send me a blob store and you put the name in the URL, so this is another type of request, and we can dive into this a little bit too. If we hit try it out here, and I just put like default in here and hit execute, bad things would happen. I don't want to do that. But let's do like Bob, for example, and say execute so we can at least see the request. So had this worked, you can see where the name kind of ends up in the URL. You don't necessarily have to have a body for a request. You can do an API that has query strings in it as well, which is when you see that like ampersand and then question marks around stuff, that's query string parameters. That's another way that you can interact with APIs. It's hit or miss whether an API does it that way or not. If it's going to be a Swagger doc like this, chances are it's going to be a body and a request and not a query string. But it is important to know that some APIs are that way, that you can do it all within the URL and not have to worry about a body at all. What else is inside of here that might be interesting? I think that covers everything that I wanted to look at in terms of a Swagger doc. Just to show you a couple of other things and show you how vastly different API stuff can be. This is a Swagger doc API reference. This is the API reference for Twitter. As you can see, it's not really as neat. It's neat, but it's different than Swagger. So if you wanted to, you could like get all your liked tweets or whatever. And if you go in here, you can see here's the endpoint URL. Here's all the authentication methods. Here's the path parameters, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the query parameters. And then here's some example code stuff in different languages. It's not as easy to read this and understand what's going on as it is in a Swagger doc. you can kind of write your documentation however you want to. So it's kind of up to you what you use. I prefer Swagger for everything. But yeah, you'll as you get started playing with APIs and trying to figure out how to wrap things, be prepared for a little bit of confusion and a lot of red text and a lot of staring at the screen wondering what the hell's going on as you're trying to figure things out. These actually have a couple of helpful links inside of here though, and I don't think I have a Postman install on my Mac. I don't. But Postman is a great tool for playing around with APIs before you start tinkering with a PowerShell. So what you can do in here is basically tell it what request type you want, what the URL is going to be, and then start filling out all the different parameters, whether that's if you use params like it shows here. And let me see if I can't zoom this image in or click on this image. Can I see this a little bigger?
Yeah, and Stevie, I was also going to mention, as you were talking here, that APIs can vary in complexity a bit.
They can.
And so when you're starting, it's a lot easier to start with a really simple API, maybe one that doesn't even require like any actual authentication, and just getting and putting
100%.
You know, and posting, and before you move to the Twitter API that has probably a very specific way of dealing and getting back lots of different types of information.
Yes, absolutely. 100%. But Postman is a great tool. It's pretty easy to at least poke things in this before you go writing any PowerShell code. It's pretty fun. So the param section, you can do like that query string nonsense that I was talking about. The body can do the body stuff that I was talking about. And yes, as people are saying in the chat, you can Choco install Postman, and it will give you that application. It's available out there on the community repository. So it's really quick to install it and keep it upgraded. You can also do this kind of stuff with the web browser as well. So just to show you that, let me do a GET request on this one. And I can do an F12 here. And just to show you what this looks like, if I do an execute on this, we can see this request come through. And if we look at the headers, you can see here are my request headers. And then here's my preview of the response, basically. And if we look at the response, here's what it came back as. And if you really want to cheat and get started quickly, I don't recommend this, but to get started, it does work. If you come in here and right click on this request and say copy, you can say copy as PowerShell. And then you can open up a VS Code and do a little paste inside of here. And it will give you everything you need. Now, this does it in a weird way that I don't particularly like. One, it uses Invoke web requests instead of Invoke-RestMethod. But two, it gives you like all these weird cookie things and things as well, which in and of itself isn't bad, but it's just a little messy, especially for a newcomer, particularly when really all you needed to do to make this request, barring that you are authenticated, would be Invoke-RestMethod against this URL here. And this is going to fail in spectacular fashion, but I want to type application JSON, and let's do a method of a get, which is default behavior for Invoke-RestMethod. If you just do Invoke-RestMethod URI, it's going to assume you meant get and try that. Anything else, you definitely want to specify the method, but by default, it's a get. But you can see the Invoke-RestMethod way of doing things is quite a bit simpler than all this nonsense that Chrome DevTools gave you. But if you are just getting started and want to really do something quickly, it's there. It's been there for a while now. I don't know how known that feature of DevTools is in Chrome, but it's there. It's been there for a while, and it does what it says on the tin. It works. Yeah, let's look at one more API example before we start having a little bit more fun. So we've got the Cloudflare API as well, just to give you yet another example of what API documentation could look like. This one's a little bit easier to read, in my opinion, than the Twitter one, but still not as good as a regular Swagger doc is. It gives you the required parameters. So for this one, you need an API key, you need an email, or you need a user service key, depending on what authentication method you're going to use with a specific header. So you can either send an XAuth key header with your API key, or an auth email with an email address, or a service key. And it might need to have one, the other, both, all three. It kind of depends on the API, what the authentication looks like. Now, I am going to show you a really cool module out there that takes, say we want to take this and turn it into PowerShell. There is a module out there from the Poshwoof called curl to PS, which will take that curl string that we just copied. So if we were to come in here and say CS equals, and then let's do a here string and paste this in and close this off, we can then do convert to IRM and then my CS, and we get a hash table back with everything we need to splat that to IRM. So if we were to do like splat equals that and then do IRM at splat, it's going to fail because obviously that's not right data in that example request. But that would work, and it would allow you to really quickly say, hey, here's a curl example from this documentation. I want to really quickly use this with the Invoke-RestMethod. Well, you can do that with that module. It's relatively accurate. You might have some cases where the curl doesn't quite 100% convert correctly into the splat, but it's pretty good, and it does speed you up quite a bit. So just so you guys are aware, curl to PS is out there. It's available. You can install it from the gallery install module.
If I can remind you, Mr.
handy.
Stevie, if I can remind you, whenever you hit a web page, just zoom it up 1 or 2 on each page.
Oh, does it not keep it remembered? Damn it. I forget every single time. But yeah, curl to PS. It's pretty handy. And let's have some fun now. Let's put some of this into practice. Now, I've already done a ton of work with this API because I've already got a PowerShell module called Nexus Shell, which wraps almost 100% of this API as PowerShell modules, but we'll kind of break it down a little bit and show you what it looks like to actually attempt something like this yourself. So we are definitely going to need some authentication for this. So let me kind of minimize a bunch of these so that I can find the authentication piece in here. Oops, that No. This repository management. This is an absolutely huge API. There's a ton of stuff in here. Privileges. Yeah, look at all this stuff. There's so much stuff that you can do in here. Now, if I remember correctly, which one of these? Actually, I think it's just a header that you need. Let me make sure. Just see for a second. Yeah. Where is the authentication method? All right, I'm gonna go cheap. And we'll zoom this in just a little bit. Why? What did it do? Where did it go?
We still see it.
Yeah. What the heck is going on? Why did you do that? I don't understand why it did that. What is it doing? Weird house. All right, fine. That works. So if we go to source and we go to public and we scroll down, we get this. Let me see if I remember how to do this. Yeah.
They say a man who presents live has a fool for a presenter.
Yes, that's me. I'm this guy. So we do that, and then we send the result, and we get that back. Beautiful. Okay, yeah. So all the authentication is on this one is a header. I was thinking of a different one. If we go to docs.chocolatey, just to show you an example of what it would look like differently. Usage, API examples. We'd first need to authenticate to the API, and that's where we do this here. If you notice, we write a session variable here, and then the session variable is passed to everything else. If you do a session variable, that saves a cookie, basically. And then inside of that session variable, there's a cookie that is your authentication cookie. And then you can use a web session to pass that back and forth. So that's how our central management does it, is via that cookie. The Nexus API is just a header, and I had to remind myself of that because it's been a minute. So if we look at this, I'm just going to real quickly steal this code so I can walk through it over here. Let's just put this in. Let's put this in here, and let's zoom this in a little bit. Close this out. And minimize this down. So what are we doing? This creates an authentication header that you will use for all your other calls to this API. Once you have that header crafted, you can just pass that header to other Invoke web request calls, and it'll be right. In this example, we take the name of the server. So in this case, it would be chocoserver.steviecoaster.dev. We give it the credentials of the user that you want to authenticate to the API. In this case, we'll use the admin account on the server because that's the only one that exists because it's a demo box. The path, which could potentially be different depending on the server you hit, because in this particular case, Nexus has the concept of a context path. So this could be something like 8443/Nexus to get to the root of the server instead of just hanging off of the port here, for example. So we take into account that you might have a context path, and we provide you with parameters to tell me whether or not this is an SSL-backed instance of Nexus and what the SSL port is. By default, Nexus will use port 8443 when you're using SSL, but if that's the only web server running on the box, you might want to make that run on 443, so you change it. But the default is 8443, so it's set as default here. And then based on those parameters, if we say this uses SSL, we set that protocol variable in the script scope so this is available across the entire module to HTTPS, and then we set the port to whatever you specify the SSL port to be so that we get whatever is after the colon correct. Otherwise, we set the protocol to HTTP and the port to 8081 because that's the defaults for a regular non-SSL instance of Nexus. And typically that doesn't change when I've never seen a Nexus instance run on port 80, for example. It seems to always run on 8081. That could probably be improved, but whatever. And then we set the host name variable to a script scope, again, just so that we can reuse it other places across the module. And then we set our context path to whatever that path variable is. And then very importantly, we get into different types of authorization inside of headers. In this case, we're going to use basic authorization, which is just, hey, the word basic and then a space and then a base64 encoded username and password pair. So it's username : password base64 encoded. Now I did it this way for compatibility reasons. If you're just straight up using PowerShell 7 or PowerShell 6 and newer, I think, it does have the authentication and token stuff baked into it. So you can do like Invoke-RestMethod and then authentication. There's basic and bearer, I believe. Yeah. And then for those things, if you use authentication, basic, and then a credential with a get credential object, for example, it will do this bit for you. You don't have to worry about this stuff. It's all automatic. So if you're going to do anything with APIs, pretend that Windows PowerShell is dead. Just use PowerShell 7. It's so much better in PowerShell 7 when you're working with APIs. The way the data is formatted and returned to you by the commandlet is amazing. There's all this additional authentication stuff baked into it. There's a ton of extra stuff on Invoke-RestMethod now. And actually, if we do get help RestMethod online, let's just go to the docs. Like, there's a lot of parameters that you can give to Invoke-RestMethod now in PowerShell 7.3 as opposed to PowerShell 5.1. So you can see it's a way less robust in Windows PowerShell than it is in PowerShell 7. It's absolutely a dream to work with in PowerShell 7. Paging is nicer inside of it. Form stuff is nicer inside of it. It's just better if you're going to do API stuff, forget that Windows PowerShell even exists. Just use PowerShell 7. And then what else? So we build that header, and we don't actually need, we do keep that credential hanging around for a very special reason in this particular module. Pretend that doesn't exist though. And then we make a request to an endpoint. I've picked the status endpoint here to just use that header just to make sure that it worked. So we can say error action stop, and then if that request worked, we get connected to the host name, and then if it didn't work, it throws an exception message. So if we were to take a look at this and we were to run connect access server, and we were to say hostname me. Hopefully you guys can see that terminal okay. And then I want to use SSL, and I want a credential of, oops. Yeah, see, didn't work. So now, if I say admin,
maybe control plus that, just one.
Little bit.
Yep.
How's that? A little better? Yeah. So as you see, I typed my password wrong the first time, and I got a 401 unauthorized. And then the second time, I got connected. So I've now successfully got my header stored as a scoped variable. I'm outside of my module right now, so it's going to be a little bit different. But let's go back to where there it is. Let's go back to this, and let's go interact with an API. And I'm probably going to have to go. All right, server, don't be dumb. Why are you being dumb? Is this you? No. Is this you? Yeah, you're fine. Why are you being dumb over here? Alrighty then. That looks good. Let's go back to this API. Let's see, what can I grab? Let's do a repository. So repositories, let's find a NuGet hosted one. Let's do this one. So what does this look like? We're going to write a commandlet that will leverage this API to list all, or give me back an object of all of the NuGet hosted repositories on this server. So if I were to do chocolate internal and I hit execute and I look at this request, this is the request URL, and it did use just a URL. There's no body to this. And then it gives me an object that looks like that. So what I like to do when I design APIs is I take this and I'm going to say function, and let's give this a name. I know it's a GET request, so I'm going to call it GET. And I know it's against a Sonatype Nexus API or a Nexus server, so I'm going to say Nexus. And then what am I actually getting? I'm getting a NuGet hosted repo, for example. And then if we look at the API, we have a parameter that is a string called repository name, and it's required. So in my function, I want to do commandlet binding, and let's build a parameter, and let's call it, definitely want it to be mandatory. We want it to be a string, and we want to call it repository name so that it matches the parameter here. Now, it doesn't have to really match 100%. Like if you wanted to just call it repository, you could. But I like to be as close to what the actual parameter is in the schema of the JSON as possible, so that when I'm looking at the code here and looking at the schema, they match kind of one-to-one. And then what do we need? That's all the parameters for this API. So what we need is a process block, and then we need a URL. So if we look, we're going to cheat a little bit and just grab this URL here, because I know that's what it is. It's a little bit different in Nexus Shell how I've done things, but that's more for part 2 because I'm doing some weird things over there. So I'm just going to define a URI variable equals, and I'm going to put this in here. Do that. And what I'm going to do is take this variable and put it right here, so that because this is in double quotes, that variable will expand out and that URL will be correct based on that. If I were to do this in single quotes, that variable would not expand, and you would try to get a repository literally named $repository name, and you would have a bad time, and you would pull your hair out because you're like, why is it happening? What am I doing wrong? And then you realize you used the wrong quotes, and then you kick yourself for a while, and then you move on. At least that's how it works with me. So what do we need next? We need to call Invoke-RestMethod. We know that, but what do we need to call it with? So what I like to do to keep my lines really short, because your brain scrolls this way a lot better than it scrolls this way. So keep your lines short if you can. And what that might do here, like you might even make this a little bit shorter yet and break this apart. But I also realize that I'm zoomed in a little bit farther than I normally would be, so this is fine. So what I'm going to do is call this IRM params, and this will be a hash table that I can use to splat it. And what do I know I need to pass to Invoke-RestMethod for this to work? Well, I know I'm going to need a URI, and we've defined that above. And I know I'm going to need a method, which I know it defaults to get, but be explicit because it'll bite you in the rear end if you don't. I know I need headers. And because of the way I've crafted this connect, they're script level, so they are available. So I can say headers. And let's add to this. And then we also need to tell it the content type of application JSON, so that Invoke-RestMethod knows what kind of data is expected from the response, so it can do the right thing to format it and give it back to us. And then we need to splat it. So Invoke-RestMethod at IRM params. That's a whole lot better splatted and readable than doing Invoke-RestMethod, URI, method, get, content type, blah, blah, blah. You kind of get the point. Splatting is amazing. Now, let's just see what this function does, shall we? So let's do get nexus NuGet hosted repo repository name chocolatey test and see what it gives me. 403 for bit. Oh, you know what? This, yeah, that's gonna leak. This isn't going to work outside of this, so I'm going to make this a little better. Better mandatory. Patient.ps credential. Oops.
We can tell you've typed that before.
A few times. Yeah, it's been a few times. And then let's just steal this and this and this. And put this here and clean this up ever so slightly. Get rid of this. Let's do, oh, you know what? I called it headers and not header. So let me do this. It's going to ask me for a credential. That's fine. There we go. That works. There's a question. Is it okay to use PS credential instead of typing all that out? Absolutely. That one will probably be fine. I just know that I've been bitten in the ass before by assuming that .NET will find the right type for me, where the ending type might be the same in 2 or 3 different classes. And the only way to get the right one is to fully qualify it. And best practice is to fully qualify this stuff anyways, in terms of these kind of things. Just so you don't run into any surprises. But yes, doing it as just PS credential will work. I've just been bitten in the ass enough times to know that fully qualify it, please. So this works, and this gives me everything I would expect. So if we look at this and we do the same exact thing again, actually, let me do this. Cred equals get credential. Actually, I'm going to grab my stool. Feet are tired. Standing all day. There we go. A little bit more comfortable. And then we do cred. That looks good. Then we can do this, and we can pass a credential like that. And let's do result equals that. So now if we do result, we can do get member on it. And if we look at this, it is in fact a PS custom object. So yay. You didn't have to do anything magic to get that object back. You just got a one-to-one, whatever was defined in the schema of the API as something that would be returned is what you'll get back via the API. So in this result object, if I wanted to, I could just do .name and get name. I could do .storage and give me all the information about the storage. So for this, we've got a blob store name of default, content type validation of true, and write policy of allow, etc., etc. It's all there. I didn't have to do any extra work. it just magically happened for me. It's great. But let's say that perhaps result had too much data inside of there. I don't really care, or I want to do something different. For example, we could go out and go off into the weeds and change this a bit. So we could say result in our function looks like this, and then we could say PS custom object, and then we could say blob store name, for example, is equal to result dot name. And let's say we know that the format is NuGet because the commandlet was get nexus NuGet hosted repository. So I don't care about that one. I don't care about the URL either. I do care about whether it was online or not. So I'm going to say online equals result dot online. And I care about cleanup policy stuff. So cleanup policy equals result dot cleanup. And that's all I want, because I know the type is hosted. So if I were to F5 this, come up here and rerun this again and do result, I get just the data back I cared about. I manipulated it inside of the function to control exactly what it looked like to the end user. So just because the API schema dictates that this endpoint is going to give me back this information doesn't mean that's gospel when you're wrapping an API and giving it back to the end user. It's just going to mean that you have flexibility there, right? If you want to change things around, you can. Yes, this is a PS custom object. You could do other stuff here too. You could implement classes so that this thing is like a very specific type even. Maybe you want this to be returned such that you could do something like a NuGet hosted repo type. Like, that gets really into the weeds of using classes with PowerShell and then wrapping APIs. That's for down the road. Come to Summit. But you can do all kinds of cool stuff with APIs inside of PowerShell. I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a while and not paying attention to chat, and it's been quiet. So if there's any questions that haven't been answered in the chat, I know we got some pretty smart API folks.
I think we've been keeping up with it.
So, okay, cool.
Yeah, I think we've been keeping up with it. Some people have some questions, but I think Clem has been doing a fine job of helping people out.
Excellent.
Hey, Stevie, in this particular example, up above, you have results equals and then IRM, and you're not using that particular variable anywhere else. Higher up.
Oh, where at?
The previous function. There it is.
Yeah. So this, I used the result out of habit. I could have used null here, because this API endpoint that I'm using to send a header just so I craft a header and build it, like, technically I don't even have to do this. Technically all I would have to do to make this work is something like this. So if I go to just Stevie Coaster, I just did this the other day. Make this big. Really, this is all I need. Really all I need to do. So what this function does is I can show you what this function does. So if I take this and I copy this and I put it over here, and I do get or new encoded credential cred, it's going to give me that base 64 encoded credential back to the terminal. But if I say as header, it's going to give me that header back. So if I were to do something like this, for example, I could then do Invoke-RestMethod, some URL, something header, and it would work. I don't necessarily have to call an endpoint here. All I really need to do is build a header. But the reason I call an endpoint here is to validate that I gave it the correct credentials. Because if you saw when I first used this connect function, I got a 401 unauthorized back. That's because I typed my password wrong. I didn't want to create a header with the wrong password and not know it after I used the connect function and everything looked good. And then I moved on and I used another function. And then all of a sudden it blew up in my face with the 401 unauthorized. I'm calling this particular endpoint here because it gives some sort of a simple JSON response back that I don't care about. So I just null it. I don't care. I just care that the Invoke-REST method worked so that I can wrap that in a try catch with error action stop. So if it worked, great. If not, throw a message. In this case, 401 unauthorized. But that's why I use result. I'm just used to typing result equals because I'm burying the response. I don't want to see whatever the output of this was. And yes, it's PowerShell 7, which right host doesn't kill puppies in. So it's perfectly fine. Hushy.
Stevie, it looks like we got two people that wanted to ask questions. So Jason,
Go for it.
what you got?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. I guess if you have like a best practice for this scenario, if you're building a module, writing several commandlets within that module to interact with an API, a lot of times you look at situations like Azure, connect dash whatever, right? Login dash whatever. They're logging in once, getting that token, that bearer token, and they're stuffing it somewhere. And then after that, subsequently, you're not having to stick a credential on every single command, right?
Correct.
Do you have a best practice for sharing that credential between your different commandlets in that module?
In this particular, the easiest thing to do is script scope because that locks it into that module. So if you were to say Nexus Shell is a really good example. It uses a script scoped header variable. That is available to all the functions in that module. But if I were to use Invoke-RestMethod outside of that module and try to pass header to it, it wouldn't know what the hell I was talking about. That doesn't exist. So it lives inside of the scope of that module. Can you get to it with PowerShell? Yes, you can. What's the likelihood of somebody knowing how to do that? It depends on your team. If your team is full of really, really smart PowerShell people, using a script scope variable is probably something that you could do better. But it's pretty safe. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to rely on secret management module and just have your authentication pull from a vault, like Azure Key Vault, for example, or whatever. Again, you're going to have to authenticate to that stuff somehow. But secret management is a really good way to retrieve that stuff and then pass that along.
As another module author, I'll throw out my opinion that using the script scope is typically a great way to go. Works very well. If it's something that doesn't need to be just a single instance, then yeah, using sequence management is fantastic. If you do have an instance where you need to have only one credential or one object in the entire system for whatever reason, then using something like a named mutex is a fantastic way to go as well.
Yeah. What was that?
A named mutex. It's a pattern that allows there to only be one object existing and accessible at a time on your system.
Nice.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
I think we also have a question from Ben, and so Jason, make sure you take down your hand when you're done. Nice. Okay. Hey Ben, what can we help you with?
Hello. So I actually ran into this today working on one of my modules that wraps an API, and I wanted to get your thoughts on the solution. So I had a need to determine if the results from Invoke-RestMethod actually returned anything. So in your example, the $ result, is there actually something in there? And the only way that I could figure out how to do that reliably was using, and this seems wrong, which is why I'm asking, is using the string is null or empty method on result, and that returns either true or false if Invoke-RestMethod returns something or doesn't. If I did a result measure object.count or result.count, those all returned 1, even if no results were returned. And so I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Typically what I do is I just do something like this and let PowerShell handle it for me. If result else, something else. Because if this didn't give me anything back, this is going to be empty and this is going to be false. So it's quick and dirty. It doesn't work 100% of the time. Checking if this is null is really good. So if null not equal result, for example.
Yeah, that I tried that too, and that didn't work for me. Like,
yeah,
it doesn't technically not null. So
yeah, exactly. It
for
depends on the endpoint. It depends on the endpoint too. Like there are cases where Invoke-RestMethod, no matter what, is going to have something returned from the API. I've seen that a time or two, where that something is junk. It's completely worthless, but Invoke-RestMethod got something, so there's something in there.
That seems to be what I'm getting in my case. So yeah.
What's the API? Just out of curiosity, is it like something internal or?
It's something internal and actually something that I wrote too. So
I gotcha.
yeah, it's written on. I wrote it using the Laravel PHP framework.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm familiar.
But yeah, apparently, even though I'm returning no results, Laravel is still for some reason or returning something, or Invoke-RestMethod sees something. Because yeah, the result is not null even when no results are returned from the API.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it might be a side effect of Laravel.
Yeah, that's my guess as well. But yeah, cool. Thank you, appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anything else?
I don't see any other hands up, so
cool.
Feel free to go how you please.
All right, I'm just gonna skate it through.
Best practices for short-lived tokens and stuff.
I don't do a whole lot of stuff with APIs where I have to worry about that, so I don't have a ton of experience with handling short-lived tokens. What you could do is, so for example, we've used this connect Nexus server function to create this header and return that back, and then it's used other places like here for example. What you could potentially do is do a try catch here. So do a try. If it fails and the error message is a 401 unauthorized, for example, just run your connect again.
Gotcha.
You can do it inside of here, so you can say, and it might not be exactly that. You would need to send your connect again, whatever that is, whatever that's going to look like, just to refresh that token. And there are ways. Let me see. It does.
Do like a write output. Your credentials have expired, and your catch block, connect, and then a continue or something like that.
Most of the like really good APIs have some way to like read off the token.
Oh yeah, I mean they're all over the place. Some, you can renew your bearer. You can have like a refresh token.
Yeah, exactly. They're
all.
Yeah, it's again, it's up to the API how they implement their authentication, how it's handled. But
What I've done in a module that I worked on, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
What I've done in a module I recently worked on was I created a single object that acted as like I don't know if this is the right term, but a state machine for it. So once you did your connect command, it created that object. And then built within the connect command, I had a variable of what the token bearer lifetime would be that you can get from the docs. And I always added like a pad to it, like minus a minute or minus 5 minutes or whatever, so that, it technically never really runs out. And then within my module, I had one generic command. So each subcommand, like say get some record, would just set the splatting parameters for then a single do the dirty work command. And then the dirty work command checks the global object, looks for the, to see, hey, is the bearer still alive or did it expire? If not, it just reruns the connect command. And if not, then it just does the needful, if you will. So that's kind of how I did it. And it actually worked really well.
Nice. One of the things I'll throw out, I put it in the chat, but Invoke-RestMethod has this follow rel link parameter to it. So if you have an API that returns data in chunks, pages of records, for example, and has returns the proper kinds of headers that tells you how to get the next chunk. The follow rel links will do that for you, so you don't have to write code to get the next page, and it returns everything all at once. And so, if you're timing out because you're manually paging through the data, that may be a way to avoid a timeout.
Yes, and I believe I can check the docs. Let me look. That
must be pretty new.
Yeah, it is. It's not in Windows PowerShell. I was almost sure that was something that Mark put in the core commandlets. This is why I say that PowerShell core is the only way you should be interacting with APIs. The web commandlets inside of PowerShell 7 / PowerShell core, whatever you want to call it, PowerShell, are light years ahead of the Windows PowerShell stuff. And the Windows PowerShell stuff isn't going to get any of these advanced features and new functionality that's in PowerShell today.
Well, that's interesting. It is not in web request. It's only in RestMethod. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And they had to do that.
Yep. Yeah. Invoke web request is good for like web page stuff. But if you're going to do an API, use Invoke-RestMethod. because like SOAP APIs are practically dead anymore. Everything is a REST. Everything is a REST API that's really, really super popular. There's still SOAP stuff laying around, but let's face it, there's far more REST stuff. So use the commandlet with REST in the name.
So the quick question on that, because I think when I was running that module, I used web request because I wanted to make sure like the status code was like, what's that, like 200 okay or whatever. Is that available in REST method?
Do I still have result? Is it still a thing in here?
So there's a parameter called status code variable where you can get the status code.
That's what it is.
You can get the status code back in a variable and check that. There's also other ways to get at it from the result that you get. But
and then also, isn't it true that if any sort of error code like a 500 or 404 occurs with REST method that it will throw, and then you can deal with that in a try catch?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I figured as much, but I didn't know how to get the to be able to actually parse the error code out of it. At least, I was just trying to do it at 100 miles an hour and build something that worked to solve a problem real quick, and ended up writing a fully functional module instead.
Isn't that the way of it? That's the way it always goes. Yeah. I don't really know how much more I want to talk about. I've been talking for a little over an hour now, and I'm going to be doing more of this in a couple of weeks, like a part 2 thing. We'll dive into this a little bit farther.
It's funny that you mentioned that.
We'll kind of expand on this a little bit. We'll flesh this out, and we'll go into the weeds of really and truly wrapping a module a little bit.
It's funny you mentioned that because I was watching you and I was like, wow, this is what he threw together for an intro.
Yeah.
So maybe
share.
Why don't put a nice bow on this? So for those of people watching at home may not be understanding what we're talking about, Stevie helped our group out tonight with a last minute change of scheduling and jumped in and extended a demo that he's going to do for us in a month and a half into basically a 2-parter. And so tonight he put together this demo with about 90 minutes or 2 hours of prep time. And so he did an amazing job. And that's why I was saying, wow, this is what you put in an intro. And so as we mentioned, we'll be coming back in about 6 weeks or maybe less. And middle of March, he'll be presenting on essentially the part 2 of this, which will be a deeper dive. And so what I really appreciated tonight was a lot of useful examples and lots of great input from the community, lots of great questions, lots of good examples in the chat. Unfortunately, if you're watching at home, you may not see the chat because that doesn't come along with the recording. And so that's why I always encourage people to come and join us in person if possible. But Stevie, fantastic job. And I'd like to ask everybody, if they could, to give Stevie a round of applause for stepping in for us last minute. That's a really wonderful thing you did for us tonight, and we appreciate that so much.
No, not a problem.
Yeah. And so with that, folks, we're going to wrap this one up tonight. As I was just saying, this group meets in person on the first and third Wednesday of the month, and we'd love to have you come and join us so you can participate in the discussions in person and live. To do that, you can visit us at meetup.com and look for RTPSUG, or you can go to rtpsug.com and get information on how to join us at the next meeting. Phil, anything you want to wrap up with here before we finish this?
No, just encourage everybody to join us in person, and well, happy to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and so Stevie, thank you so much, and thank all of you to hanging out with us. Check out the other videos we have on our channel. We have about 120 videos, and we're sure you can find some more content. Until next time, we're going to say thank you and good night.